Walk with me to the banks of the Tiber, just outside Rome, on the 28th of October 312. Behind you, an invading army of perhaps 40,000 men has just shattered a defending force more than twice its size. Ahead, across a single narrow bridge, the man who has ruled Rome itself for 6 years is fleeing for his life, along with thousands of his own broken soldiers. By the time the sun sets today, one of them will be dead in this river, and the empire's entire religious future will have quietly pivoted on a single afternoon. Most of the people fighting in it do not yet understand the significance of. What does it actually take for one battle outside one city to decide which god an entire civilization will worship for the next 1,000 years? If you want the real, verified story of the Milvian Bridge, and an honest look at the vision that popular history usually tells you decided it, subscribe now. There's more of exactly this waiting for you. To understand why two Roman armies are about to collide on this riverbank at all, you have to understand how completely the system meant to prevent exactly this kind of civil war had already broken down. A generation earlier, in 293, the Emperor Diocletian had designed a power-sharing arrangement called the Tetrarchy, rule by 4, splitting supreme authority between two senior emperors called Augusti and two junior emperors called Caesars, each responsible for a different quarter of an empire that had grown too large and too threatened on too many frontiers at once for any single ruler to govern effectively alone. It was, on paper, an elegant solution to a genuine structural problem, and for a time it actually worked, providing the empire with coordinated leadership across multiple frontiers simultaneously, in a way a single emperor never could have managed unaided. The system's actual collapse can be traced to a single specific moment. In 305, Diocletian, in poor health, voluntarily stepped down from power and forced his own reluctant co-Augustus, Maximian, to do the same on the very same day, intending an orderly, planned handover to the next generation of rulers waiting behind them. That handover held together for less than a year. When Constantius died the following year, Galerius promoted his own preferred candidate rather than recognizing Constantius's son, and Constantine's own troops answered that snub by acclaiming him emperor regardless. Maxentius, watching his own father Maximian left out of this new arrangement entirely, seized Rome for himself in response, defeating and eventually arranging the murder of the rival Tetrarch sent against him. By 308, a system Diocletian had designed to guarantee exactly one legitimate ruler for each quarter of the empire, instead had 4 separate men simultaneously claiming the senior title of Augustus, with no working mechanism left to settle the dispute except force. By 312, that careful system has collapsed into exactly the chaos it was built to prevent, with multiple men across the empire simultaneously claiming legitimate authority, and precisely none of them fully willing to yield to the others. Constantine's own claim begins in Britain, in the city of York, on the 25th of July, 306. His father, Constantius, dies there while campaigning, and Constantine's own soldiers, present on the spot and unwilling to wait for a distant tetrarchy to sort out a proper succession, raise him on their shields and acclaim him emperor themselves, a decision made by an army in a British garrison town rather than by any formal process in Rome. It is, from its very first moment, exactly the kind of unauthorized, bottom-up claim to power the Tetrarchy had been specifically designed to prevent. Maxentius's own claim to Rome itself is, if anything, even less official. In that same chaotic year, he seizes control of the city and much of Italy for himself, a usurper by the Tetrarchy's own rules despite being married into its ruling family, holding power through raw control of Rome's population and garrison rather than through any recognized appointment. What makes their eventual collision even stranger is how close these two men once stood to each other. In 307, years before either of them considered the other an enemy worth destroying, Constantine married Fausta, Maxentius's own sister, a marriage arranged specifically to bind two ambitious rivals together as family rather than let them drift into exactly the conflict they are now heading toward. By 312, that family bond has done nothing to prevent open war between them. This is not simply two strangers fighting for the same prize. It is a war between brothers-in-law, fought to a conclusion neither their marriage nor the wider Tetrarchy's original design had ever anticipated. By 312, these two men, each ruling through force and popular acclaim rather than legitimate succession, are on a collision course that the wider, still collapsing Tetrarchy has no real mechanism left to prevent. Maxentius, whatever else you make of his legitimacy, is not some untested amateur waiting helplessly in Rome for a stronger rival to arrive. Two separate invasions of Italy have already failed to dislodge him before Constantine even crosses the Alps. The Tetrarch Severus marches on Rome first and is defeated so thoroughly that he ends up surrendering to Maxentius's own father, Maximian, and is later put to death on Maxentius's orders. Galerius, one of the most senior and experienced tetrarchs of the entire system, attempts his own invasion afterward and abandons the campaign partway through, reportedly out of concern that his own troops' loyalty could not be trusted this deep into hostile Italian territory. Whatever mistakes Maxentius makes in the campaign to come, being an easy target was never one of them, and Constantine's eventual victory over him deserves to be measured against two previous, considerably more experienced rivals who had already failed at exactly the same task. If the idea that Rome's entire imperial succession system had already failed years before this specific battle interests you as much as it interests us, our members get more of exactly this kind of decision-by-decision breakdown, first and uncut. It's there whenever you want to go further with us. Constantine crosses into Italy with an army that later sources place at around 40,000 men, a number worth treating with the same caution ancient battle figures usually deserve. Maxentius, by contrast, commands a considerably larger force, sources sometimes claiming as many as 100,000, safely positioned behind some of the strongest fortifications in the ancient world. The city walls of Rome itself, backed by supplies that could, in theory, outlast any siege Constantine's smaller army could realistically sustain. Before Constantine's army ever reaches Rome itself, it has already proven repeatedly that it is not simply a smaller force hoping to get lucky. Outside Turin, Constantine's cavalry outmaneuvers a heavy cavalry force loyal to Maxentius, flanking it and then finishing the job with infantry armed with iron-tipped clubs, specifically effective against armored horsemen, a genuinely inventive tactical answer to an enemy's strength. Near Brescia, another Maxentian force is routed before it can properly organize. At Verona, Constantine's army wins a harder-fought battle that costs Maxentius one of his most senior commanders, Ruricius Pompeianus, killed in the fighting. By the time Constantine's forces approach Rome itself, they arrive not as a desperate gamble, but as a battle-tested army that has already beaten 3 separate engagements against Maxentius's own generals. That advantage should have decided this entire campaign without a single major battle. Rome's walls had held against determined attackers for centuries. Maxentius, secure behind them with ample food and water, needed only to wait Constantine out, forcing his rival's smaller exposed army to eventually withdraw or starve on hostile ground far from its own supply lines. Instead, for reasons ancient sources describe with a mixture of confidence and clear retrospective embellishment, Maxentius chooses to march his forces out of the city and meet Constantine in open battle near the Milvian Bridge instead. One popular explanation for that fatal decision deserves real scrutiny rather than simple repetition. The story holds that Maxentius consulted Rome's ancient Sibylline oracle text before the battle, receiving a prophecy that the enemy of the Romans would die that day, and that he confidently, fatally misapplied that prophecy to Constantine, rather than to himself. It is a genuinely satisfying piece of dramatic irony. Modern scholarship treats the specific story as highly suspect, likely a later embellishment added to make Maxentius's fatal decision feel like fate rather than simple miscalculation. A considerably less dramatic, better supported explanation sits right there in Maxentius's own political situation inside Rome. The popular support that had carried him to power back in 306 had eroded badly in the years since, worn down by heavy taxation needed to fund both his army and his own substantial building projects, and by food shortages serious enough to trigger open unrest among the very population he needed behind him for a prolonged siege to work. A ruler who no longer fully trusts the loyalty of the city he is defending has a genuine practical reason to gamble on a quick, decisive battle instead of a long siege that might see his own restless population turn on him before Constantine's army ever managed to starve him out. Whatever actually drove him out from behind Rome's walls, it was, as far as more careful historical analysis can tell, considerably more likely to have been fear of his own increasingly unhappy subjects than a literally fulfilled ancient prophecy. Maxentius does take one genuinely practical precaution before the battle, ordering a second crossing built across the Tiber, a temporary bridge of boats lashed together near the older stone Milvian Bridge itself, meant to give his forces a backup route across the river if the fighting went against him. That precaution is about to become the single most consequential detail of the entire day. Now feel the two armies actually meet. you watch Maxentius arrange his own forces with their backs to the river, the old stone Milvian Bridge, and the hastily built pontoon crossing both close behind them, a defensive posture that leaves almost no room for an orderly retreat if the line in front of you actually breaks. Constantine's forces press forward with the same disciplined coordination that had already carried them through 3 previous engagements on the way here, and the fighting, brutal at close range along a cramped riverbank with nowhere for a beaten army to retreat into open ground, turns decisively within hours rather than dragging into the longer, more evenly matched contest Maxentius's larger numbers might otherwise have allowed. As Maxentius's line collapses, his soldiers flee back toward the river in a chaotic mass, and it is here that the pontoon bridge, built as a careful backup plan, becomes instead the mechanism of catastrophe. Overloaded far beyond what its construction could bear, crowded with panicked men trying to escape a collapsing battle line, all at once the temporary bridge gives way under the weight, pitching soldiers, horses, and Maxentius himself into the Tiber's current. Maxentius drowns in the river his own emergency escape route was supposed to help him cross, a death made considerably more ironic by the fact that the very precaution meant to save his army instead became the thing that killed him. If watching a carefully planned backup escape route become the actual cause of a ruler's death interests you the way it interests us, that same kind of decision-by-decision history is exactly what our members get first, and uncut. One genuinely concrete, well-documented sign of Constantine's shifting religious priorities does survive from the immediate aftermath. And it is worth noting precisely because it is far better a test than the more famous vision story. Entering Rome in triumph after the battle, Constantine breaks with an ancient and expected imperial tradition. He declines to climb the Capitoline Hill and offer the customary sacrifice to Jupiter at the temple that had received exactly that kind of victory offering from Roman commanders for centuries before him. It is a quiet, deliberate absence rather than a dramatic public declaration, but it is real, contemporary, and considerably harder to dispute than a vision described only in sources written years or decades after the fact. Rome itself still holds a second physical monument to exactly how completely Constantine absorbed his rival's legacy, rather than simply erasing it. Maxentius had begun construction of an enormous new basilica in the Roman Forum, a building meant to showcase his own authority to the city's population. Left unfinished at his death, it was Constantine who completed it, and the building stands today known to history as the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine, a single structure carrying both rivals' names, finished by the winner using the loser's own half-built monument to his own power. What happens next in the historical record is where this story requires the most careful handling, because what most people have heard about this battle rests on considerably shakier evidence than the confident cinematic version usually presented. Popular memory holds that Constantine, before this battle, experienced a divine vision instructing him to fight under the sign of Christianity, and that this single moment marks the beginning of the Roman Empire's conversion to the new faith. The actual ancient sources describing that vision do not agree with each other on nearly enough details to support that clean, simple version. Lactantius, writing closest to the actual events, describes a dream Constantine experienced the night before the battle, instructing him to mark his soldiers' shields with a specific Christian symbol, the Chi-Rho, formed from the first 2 Greek letters of Christ's name. This dream, in Lactantius's account, occurs after Constantine has already crossed the Alps into Italy, shortly before the actual battle takes place. Eusebius, writing considerably later and specifically in his biography of Constantine, composed only after the emperor's own death, describes something quite different. Not a nighttime dream, but a dramatic daytime vision witnessed by the entire army, a cross of light appearing above the sun itself, accompanied by words in Greek that Eusebius renders as a promise of victory through this sign, seen while Constantine was still north of the Alps, well before the actual campaign into Italy had even properly begun. The specific Latin phrase later generations came to associate with this moment, "in this sign you will conquer," comes down to us through this same later, more elaborate telling rather than the earlier, more restrained account. These are not simply 2 slightly different tellings of the same basic event. They disagree on when it happened, where it happened, and specifically what was seen. More tellingly still, Eusebius's own earlier work, written while Constantine was still alive, describes divine assistance helping Constantine's cause without describing any specific vision at all. The dramatic, elaborate skycross story appears for the first time only in Eusebius's later biography, written after the one person who could have confirmed or denied the details was no longer alive to be asked directly. None of this proves Constantine experienced nothing at all before this battle. It does mean the specific vivid version most popular retellings confidently describe is built on a source that added its most dramatic details only after its subject's death, layered over an earlier, considerably more modest account that does not fully agree with it. Constantine's own official monument to this victory reflects exactly this kind of careful ambiguity, rather than a confident Christian declaration. The Arch of Constantine, raised in Rome shortly after the battle, credits his victory to what its inscription calls, in the original Latin, Instinctu Divinitatis, by the instigation of the divinity. The phrase names no specific god at all, a deliberate ambiguity that let Christian Romans read it as a reference to their own god, while traditional Roman citizens, still a significant portion of the population and of Constantine's own court, could read the same words as a reference to Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun god long associated with earlier emperors and still very much a fixture of Roman religious life at this exact moment. Constantine's own monument to this battle was built, quite deliberately, to mean different things to different audiences, rather than to announce a finished religious transformation. What actually follows this battle, in terms of concrete policy, is also more modest and more collaborative than popular memory usually allows. The document commonly remembered today as the Edict of Milan, credited to Constantine alone as a sweeping declaration of Christian religious freedom, was not, in the strict sense, an edict at all, and it was not Constantine's alone to issue. It emerged from a meeting in the northern Italian city of Milan in early 313 between Constantine, ruling the west, and Licinius, his fellow emperor, ruling the east, a joint policy agreement on religious toleration rather than a single formal decree. The version of it that actually survives comes down to us as a letter Licinius sent to provincial governors in the eastern half of the empire, implementing an agreement the two men had reached together rather than a document Constantine personally authored and issued on his own authority. Constantine's victory at Milvian Bridge does not on its own make him sole ruler of the entire Roman world, and it is worth resisting the temptation to skip straight from this battle to a unified Christian empire as though nothing else needed to happen in between. Licinius still rules the East as a fellow Augustus, and their own uneasy partnership, sealed at that Milan meeting in early 313, holds only for a time before it too collapses into open war between them more than a decade later. The empire Constantine actually comes to rule alone is still years and several more campaigns away from this riverbank, and this particular battle's real achievement is considerably narrower than popular memory usually credits it with. It secures the western half of the empire under one ambitious, capable ruler, and nothing more sweeping than that on the day itself. None of this careful correction means Milvian Bridge was not genuinely significant, or that Constantine's own eventual embrace of Christianity was not real and consequential. It clearly was both. What the honest version of this story actually shows is something more interesting than a single instant, miraculous conversion. A shrewd, politically careful ruler who won a decisive battle through real tactical skill, and his opponent's serious blunder, who commemorated that victory in language deliberately vague enough to satisfy both halves of a religiously divided empire, and whose actual, gradual shift toward Christianity unfolded over years of careful political maneuvering rather than resolving completely in one dramatic afternoon beside a river. So think back to that riverbank, to a bridge of boats collapsing under the weight of a fleeing army. Constantine's own mother, Helena, low-born and largely sidelined years earlier when his father's political ambitions required a more advantageous marriage, rises alongside her son's fortunes in the years following this exact victory, eventually becoming one of the most consequential religious figures of the entire century in her own right. That is a story belonging to its own telling rather than a rushed footnote here. It is worth noting only because it shows how much of what this battle actually set in motion took years, and other people's choices entirely separate from Constantine's own, to fully unfold. You were never simply watching one battle, a civilization's religious future, in a single afternoon. You were watching a usurper's fatal decision to abandon Rome's own walls, a backup escape route that became the instrument of his death, and a victory that a careful, ambitious ruler chose to describe in language vague enough to mean whatever each of his subjects needed it to mean. The vision popular memory remembers as a single blinding moment of certainty was, in the actual surviving sources, two different stories that do not agree with each other, one of them added only after the man who supposedly saw it was no longer alive to confirm it. What is not in dispute is simpler, and in its own way just as remarkable. A bridge of boats gave way on an October afternoon. A brother-in-law drowned in the river. His own family's marriage alliance had once been arranged to prevent this exact war from happening, and the empire's religious future tilted a little further in a direction it would not fully commit to for years still to come. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the legends checked against what the sources can actually support, the visions that turn out to be two contradictory stories rather than one certain miracle, the victories commemorated in language careful enough to satisfy everyone at once. There's another one waiting for you. Click it and walk with us.